Assassin's Creed is a franchise that will spend thousands of hours recreating the exact texture of a 15th century cobblestone and then make a mistake so stupid it feels like nobody on the team owned a map. From broken physics, to impossible timelines, to one ship that should have sunk before it left the dock, today I'm breaking down the dumbest mistakes in the entire series, starting with one that's honestly kind of adorable, Monteriggioni Villa Density. Here's the thing about the Villa Auditore in Assassin's Creed 2, it looks incredible. This sprawling, dominant mansion sitting inside the walls of Monteriggioni, acting as the Assassin Brotherhood's headquarters and Ezio's personal upgrade playground. But if you've ever actually looked at the real Monteriggioni, you'd realize Ubisoft pulled off the most confident geographic lie in the entire franchise. The real Monteriggioni is tiny, a small Tuscan hilltop village with scattered stone buildings and enough breathing room that you could throw a football across the entire settlement. The in-game villa doesn't just sit inside the town, it practically is the town. The mansion appears larger than the actual village it supposedly occupies, which isn't a slight exaggeration for gameplay purposes. It's a complete geographic fabrication. Is this forgivable? Honestly, yeah. Ubisoft needed a hub world worth upgrading, and a historically accurate Monteriggioni would have been 3 houses and a goat, but it perfectly captures their weird relationship with scale. They'll obsess over getting the stitching on Ezio's robes historically accurate, and then casually build a mansion the size of a small country inside a village you could walk across in 45 seconds. If you think a slightly oversized villa is bad, wait until we get to a ship that literally should not float. Leap of faith physics. Let's talk about the single most iconic move in Assassin's Creed history, the leap of faith. You climb to the highest point on the map, the camera pulls back to show you the gorgeous view, the music swells, and you swan dive off a 200-foot cathedral into a cart of hay. Beautiful, cinematic, majestic, and a guaranteed death sentence in real life. Here's the thing. A human body falling from that height reaches terminal velocity at roughly 120 miles per hour. At that speed, you need a massive deceleration distance to survive the stop. We're talking something like a specialized airbag system or hundreds of feet of open water. You know what doesn't provide that? A thin pile of dried grass sitting in a wooden cart. The math is brutal. At terminal velocity, the impact force on your body would be equivalent to getting hit by a car going highway speed. Hay compresses almost instantly under that kind of load, which means your body goes from 120 to 0 in a fraction of a second. That's not a soft landing. That's catastrophic spinal trauma. Your neck alone would experience forces so extreme that survival isn't even a conversation. And players have been doing this gleefully for nearly 2 decades. Every single game. Hundreds of times per playthrough. Nobody questions it. Nobody hesitates. You see the hay, you jump. It's muscle memory at this point. The community has made entire physics breakdown videos proving exactly how dead you'd be, and honestly, that makes it even better. The leap of faith is a cultural institution built entirely on a beautiful, beautiful lie, and we wouldn't change a single thing about it, but at least the leap of faith has charm. The next mistake on this list, not so much. Machiavelli's age discrepancy. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1488, Ezio meets Niccolo Machiavelli for the first time, and the game presents this guy as a seasoned, worldly political operative. He carries himself like someone who's been navigating Italian politics for decades. He looks like he's in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. He talks down to Ezio. He acts like the wise mentor guiding a younger, less experienced assassin through the complexities of Renaissance power struggles. Machiavelli was born in 1469. That makes him 19 years old during this meeting. 19, a teenager. And not just any teenager, a teenager who, historically, was still a student in Florence at the time. He wasn't traveling across Italy as some grizzled political mastermind. He was studying, probably reading books and arguing with classmates about philosophy. But here's the kicker. Ezio, the guy the game frames as the younger and more naive character in this dynamic, was actually born in 1459. He's 10 years older than Machiavelli. So Ubisoft accidentally created a scene where a 29-year-old trained assassin is taking life advice from a college freshman who looks like he pays a mortgage. And it gets worse when you look at the actual history. The game portrays Machiavelli as fiercely opposed to the Borgia family, positioning him as this anti-Borgia crusader from the jump. But historical records show the exact opposite. Machiavelli actually had a documented friendly relationship with Cesare Borgia during this period. He admired Cesare's political ruthlessness. The man literally wrote about Borgia as a model leader in The Prince. So not only did the game get his age completely wrong, they inverted his entire political stance. They took a teenage student, aged him up by a decade, flipped his ideology 180 degrees, and then made the actual adult in the room look like the inexperienced kid. But at least Machiavelli's mistake is limited to one character. The next entry breaks an entire century of technology. Child labor depiction timing. Assassin's Creed Syndicate wants you to feel like a hero for saving children from factories. And look, the sentiment is great. Nobody's arguing that child labor is good. But here's the thing. The game is set in 1868. And by 1868, child labor in England had already been regulated for decades. Let me explain. The game's child liberation side quests present child labor as this raging, unchecked atrocity happening in real time. You bust into factories, free kids from terrible conditions, and the game frames it like you're exposing some hidden underground horror that nobody's addressing. Except the British government had been addressing it since the 1830s. By the time Jacob and Evie Fry are running around London, children working in factories were legally required to receive multiple hours of schooling per day, a mandate that had been on the books since the Factory Act of 1833 and strengthened further in 1844. Factory inspectors existed. Enforcement was active. Were conditions still rough in some places? Absolutely. But the widespread, completely unregulated nightmare that Syndicate depicts, that's the 1840s and 1850s. Not 1868. The game essentially imported a social crisis from 20 to 30 years earlier and dropped it into a period where reform was already well underway. It's like setting a game in 2005 and acting like nobody has the internet yet. The timeline just doesn't match the outrage. And this is where it gets interesting. Syndicate clearly wanted to tackle a dark chapter of British history, which is a cool ambition, but the developers picked the messaging first and then picked a setting that didn't quite support it. They wanted Victorian London for the aesthetic, the gas lamps, the top hats, the industrial grime, but the specific injustice they built entire quest lines around had largely moved on by that point in history. Fans still debate whether this was intentional anachronism for dramatic effect or just sloppy research. Either way, the result is a game that asks you to feel moral outrage over a problem it's depicting about 25 years too late, but at least Syndicate only got the timing wrong. The next mistake breaks something far more fundamental to the entire franchise: doorknob anachronism. After all that historical weight, let's talk about doorknobs. The round doorknob as we know it today didn't become standard hardware until the mid-1800s. Assassin's Creed Unity is set in 1789. Sure, wealthy European households had decorative knob-like handles before that, but the mass-produced, standardized round doorknobs plastered all over Unity, those are a product of the industrial era. And yet, from the very first cutscene, modern-style doorknobs are everywhere. Every interior, every building, every single door Arno walks through features hardware that looks straight out of the 1800s, not revolutionary France. Now, on its own, this would be a funny little oversight, a background prop nobody would think twice about. But here's where it gets good. Ubisoft didn't quietly release Unity and hope nobody noticed the details. They did the opposite. They ran an entire marketing campaign about how historically authentic their recreation of Paris was. They hired historians. They consulted architects. They spent years researching 18th century France down to the stonework on individual buildings. They rebuilt Notre Dame so meticulously that when the real cathedral caught fire in 2019, people genuinely floated the idea of using Ubisoft's model as a restoration reference. It ultimately wasn't used. The game's version contained deliberate artistic liberties and lacked the precision actual restorers needed, but the fact that the conversation even happened tells you how seriously people took their recreation, and nobody checked the doors. That's the part that kills me. You can get the flying buttresses right. You can nail the cobblestone patterns and the window frames and the rooftop layouts of an entire city, but the one object every single person in the world interacts with multiple times a day, the thing you literally grab with your hand to enter a room, that's where the research stopped. Industrial era doorknobs, decades too early, in every building, in a game sold on its historical accuracy. It's not game-breaking, it's not offensive, but it might be the most perfectly ironic mistake Ubisoft has ever made. And honestly, if you think a doorknob is bad, wait until we break the laws of physics entirely. Gun accuracy. Connor Kenway is the greatest marksman in American history, and nobody gives him credit for it. Not because he's skilled, because he's using weapons that literally could not do what the game shows them doing. Here's the thing about colonial-era firearms. Muskets and pistols from the 1750s through the 1780s were not precision weapons. They weren't even close to precision weapons. The effective range on these things basically required you to press the barrel against someone's chest and pray. Hitting a target beyond a few meters wasn't marksmanship, it was luck. And I can prove it. George Washington himself rode directly along British military lines during battle and came out completely unscathed. Not a single bullet touched him. And this wasn't because the British were incompetent. These were trained soldiers firing in coordinated volleys. The reason Washington survived is that muskets were so inherently inaccurate that hitting a man on horseback at any real distance was nearly impossible. That's a real documented event. The entire reason armies of this era fought in tight formations, shoulder to shoulder, firing in massive synchronized lines, was specifically to compensate for the fact that no individual shot was going to hit anything reliably. You didn't aim. You pointed in a general direction and hoped the wall of lead did the work. Now look at Connor. This guy is pulling off casual precision pistol shots at 40 plus feet like he's holding a modern handgun. Headshots, mid-combat snipes, quick-draw kills on moving targets. The same weapons that couldn't reliably hit George Washington from close range are apparently surgical instruments in Connor's hands. To be fair, everyone understands why. You can't give the player a gun that misses 90% of the time and call that fun gameplay. Nobody's buying that. But the gap between how these weapons actually performed and how the game uses them is genuinely hilarious. Connor isn't just bending history, he's performing miracles with every trigger pull. But if you think bending the rules of physics with a pistol is bad, wait until you see what the franchise does with the laws of gravity. NPC random murder sprees. Up until now, most of the mistakes on this list have been funny. Weird anachronisms, goofy physics, stuff you can laugh about and move on. This one is different. This is where Ubisoft stopped accidentally getting things wrong and started actively building entire game systems around things that never happened. In Assassin's Creed Unity, random NPCs in the crowd will just spontaneously attack and murder other civilians. No warning, no context, no provocation. You'll be walking through revolutionary Paris, minding your own business, and some random pedestrian will just pull out a weapon and start killing people around them, like it's a normal Tuesday. Here's the thing. This didn't happen. Spontaneous civilian-on-civilian murder sprees were not a feature of daily life during the French Revolution. Were there executions? Yes. Were there organized mobs? Absolutely. But random citizens just snapping and going on killing sprees in the middle of the street? That's pure fiction. What actually existed in revolutionary Paris was a system of National Guard patrols. If you looked suspicious or unfamiliar, you'd be stopped, asked for your papers, and detained until someone could vouch for you. It was bureaucratic, paranoid, and sometimes unjust, but it was organized. It wasn't random chaos where your neighbor might stab you while you're buying bread. But here's where it gets genuinely baffling. Unity doesn't just include these random murder sprees as background noise, the game actively punishes you for not stopping them. You lose synchronization if you let civilians die. So Ubisoft invented a phenomenon that never existed in history, dropped it into a game that markets itself on historical immersion, and then built a punishment mechanic around it that holds the player morally responsible for policing fictional violence. Think about that for a second. They didn't just get history wrong. They created an entirely fake version of history, then designed gameplay systems that force you to engage with it as though it's real. That's not an oversight. That's a whole team of developers sitting in a room and deciding that revolutionary Paris needed more random murder and that you should feel bad for not preventing it. Zero historical basis, full gameplay integration. That's a special kind of wrong, and somehow it's still not the most confusing design choice Unity made. Jackdaw Cannon Overload. Let's talk about the most famous pirate ship in Assassin's Creed history and why it should be sitting at the bottom of the Caribbean before Edward Kenway ever leaves port. The Jackdaw, fully upgraded, carries 46 broadside cannons, 4 chase cannons, and 2 swivel cannons. That's 52 cannons on a single vessel. For context, the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's legendary flagship and one of the most heavily armed pirate ships ever documented in real history, maxed out at 40 cannons. And that ship was considered an absolute monster. The Jackdaw doesn't just edge past the most fearsome pirate vessel ever built. It blows past it by 12 additional cannons, making the most terrifying ship in pirate history look under-equipped by comparison. But here's where it gets really stupid. Several of the Jackdaw's cannons are physically mounted on the sail deck, not the gun deck, where cannons actually belong and where the hull has reinforced ports designed for firing. The sail deck. That's the open upper deck where rigging, masts, and navigation happen. Cannons placed there have zero structural support for recoil, zero firing lanes that make operational sense, and zero reason to exist other than Ubisoft apparently thinking more cannons equals more cool, which, fair. But also no, and we haven't even gotten to the real problem. Weight. A single naval cannon from this era weighed between 1,500 and 3,000 pounds depending on the type. Multiply that by 52, and you're looking at somewhere between 78,000 and 156,000 pounds of iron sitting on a vessel that was never designed to carry that kind of load. That's before you add cannonballs, before you add gunpowder, before you add a single crew member. The result wouldn't be a slower ship. It wouldn't be a ship that sits a little low in the water. The result would be the Jackdaw flipping upside down like a bathtub toy the moment it tried to leave harbor. The weight distribution alone would capsize the vessel before a single cannon ever fired. Naval history fans have called this the worst physics violation in the entire franchise, and honestly, it's hard to argue. The Jackdaw isn't just unrealistic. It's a floating impossibility that the ocean would reject on principle. But if you think breaking the laws of physics with a pirate ship is bad, wait until you see what Ubisoft did to the entire narrative foundation the franchise was built on. DNA doesn't work that way. Every single mistake on this list happened inside a game. A wrong date here, an impossible cannon there, but this one is different. This is the mistake the entire franchise is built on top of. Before a single line of code was written, before Altair ever climbed his first tower, Assassin's Creed made a decision that contradicts foundational biology, and then they ran with it for over 2 decades. The premise is simple. Your DNA stores the memories of your ancestors. A machine called the Animus reads those memories and lets you relive them. Every historical sequence you've ever played in an Assassin's Creed game depends on this being true. It's not. DNA contains genetic instructions for building and maintaining your body. Eye color, height, protein synthesis. That's what DNA does. It is a blueprint for physical traits. Memories are neural patterns encoded in brain tissue. They're formed by lived experience, stored in synaptic connections, and they die when you die. A memory you form today is not written into your genetic code. It is not passed to your children. This isn't a gray area. This isn't a disputed frontier of science. This is foundational molecular biology that's been settled for decades. DNA replication copies genetic instructions. It does not copy the time you climbed a building in Jerusalem or stabbed a Borgia guard in Venice. That information simply does not exist in your chromosomes. 0 of it. But here's where it gets really interesting. The game knows. Assassin's Creed's own in-universe database entries and codex files acknowledge that genetic memory isn't how DNA actually works. The developers wrote lore entries that essentially say, yeah, this isn't real science, but in our universe it functions this way. They invented a fictional scientific mechanism, understood it was fictional, documented that it was fictional inside their own game, and then spent 15 plus years building every single modern day storyline on top of it. Every Animus session, every Desmond sequence, every Layla Hassan mission, every time the screen glitches and pulls you out of history, all of it rests on a premise that the creators themselves admitted doesn't hold up. They didn't accidentally get the science wrong, they knowingly chose to ignore it, and then built an entire franchise mythology around the gap. And honestly, that might be the most Assassin's Creed thing on this entire list. But speaking of franchise-defining problems, the last entry isn't about a single mistake. It's about Ubisoft abandoning an entire storyline that took a decade to build. Abandoned modern-day plot. Every single mistake on this list you can laugh at. Doorknobs in the wrong century? Funny. A ship that would sink under its own cannons? Hilarious. But this one isn't funny. This one is the most expensive mistake Assassin's Creed ever made, and I'm not talking about development budget, I'm talking about trust. For 5 games, Ubisoft built one of the most ambitious overarching narratives in gaming history. Desmond Miles wasn't just a framing device, he was the point. His story connected every historical adventure to a single escalating crisis, a global catastrophe that needed to be stopped, a satellite called the Eye, and a hidden antagonist named Juno pulling strings behind everything. From Assassin's Creed 1 through Brotherhood, Revelations, and into AC3, every modern-day sequence added another layer, another piece of the puzzle, another reason to care about what happened next. Then AC3 dropped in 2012. Desmond made his sacrifice. The world was saved, and Ubisoft just walked away. Here's where it gets genuinely insulting. Juno, the villain that multiple games spent years teasing as the true threat to humanity, the ancient being manipulating events across millennia, never got her resolution in a game. Her entire storyline was wrapped up in a comic book that the overwhelming majority of the player base never knew existed. Millions of players watched Juno's threat build across 5 mainline titles, and her defeat happened in a medium most of them would never touch. But it gets worse. The replacement protagonist, Layla Hassan, was introduced with even less development than Desmond received. players didn't connect with her. The writing gave them zero reason to. And then she was written out too, continuing the pattern of building something and abandoning it before it mattered. The modern-day Templars, who drove the franchise's core conflict for over a decade, stopped having coherent motivations entirely after AC3. They went from a terrifying shadow organization with a clear endgame to background noise. And as of the most recent entries including Shadows, modern-day story content is literally gated behind a battle pass. Players who've accessed it describe it as containing nothing of substance. Let me be clear about what happened here. This isn't a historical error, this isn't a physics oversight. Ubisoft spent 15 years constructing an apocalyptic narrative. They got millions of players emotionally invested in a specific payoff. They executed the pivotal moment, and then they abandoned every single thread that came after it. The Assassin versus Templar war in the present day, irrelevant. The Isu threat, gone. The connective tissue that made every historical setting feel like it mattered beyond itself, stripped out and never replaced. The franchise didn't just drop a plotline, it dropped its identity. And 15 years later, it still hasn't picked it back up. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.